Judges in Canada are being urged to take systemic racism into account before sentencing people who have been convicted. Representatives for Legal Aid Ontario say they plan to start nudging Ontario judges to use so-called cultural assessments in the near future. Now, this is not meant to be a get-out-of-jail-free card, but rather to give judges a fuller picture of who the accused is before deciding their fate. One of the people putting this idea forward is Wayne Vandermeet. He's the Regional Manager of Case Management and Litigation Group from Legal Aid Ontario. He's our guest from Ottawa this morning. Good morning.
Good morning, Anne-Marie.
I guess my first question is how would this go forward?
Well, so we've already started. We started a racialized community strategy here at Legal Aid Ontario, and when we were doing our research, we came across the example in Nova Scotia. So the first step we took was to invite Megan Longley from Nova Scotia to come and speak with us. And then we had a conference with a group called the Rights Advocacy Coalition for Equality, or RACE, where about 100 lawyers participated. The next step is we would like to invite both the lawyers who were involved in the case in Nova Scotia, as well as the clinical social workers, to come to Ontario and speak with Ontario lawyers and Ontario clinical social workers to figure out what an ideal cultural assessment report looks like.
And what is a cultural assessment? What factors are you looking at?
Well, a good cultural assessment report really has two main components. The first component is a review of the impact or the evidence of systemic racism. Systemic racism is not something that exists on the surface. When you do take a look at the statistics, of which unfortunately they're overwhelming and cross over all sectors of society, it's quite apparent. But if you don't look at them, they're not self-evident. So the first section would be a review of those statistics. The second section of a good report would essentially be to describe the history of the individual before the court and how systemic racism may have impacted them and contributed to the reasons they're before the court. Specifically,
what factors would you be looking at?
We'd be looking at factors like how systemic racism has impacted them. So it could be in education, for example. The statistics indicate that African Canadian children in particular are more often the subject of suspensions and expulsions, which is one of the reasons Legal Aid Ontario has provided funding for a program. There's certainly overrepresentation, unfortunately, of African Canadians and other racialized people among low-income Ontarians. There is racial profiling and policing and several other sectors. So the report would look at all of these things and, again, see how these may have impacted the individual coming before the court.
Once taking into consideration a cultural assessment and they're taking a look at all of the factors that you represented, how then would a sentencing be changed, or what would happen next for that client?
Well, it's very early stages, but having reviewed the decisions in Nova Scotia, I would say that what we're hoping for, as you said earlier, Anne-Marie, this is not a get-out-of-jail-free card. We're not looking to support no responsibility for criminal actions. What we're looking for is for a court to really meaningfully try to understand, as they need to do in all sentencing, the moral blameworthiness of the individual and whether or not the individual is able to be rehabilitated. And I think these factors that we're discussing are relevant to the courts in sentencing.
Well, this idea may be new to a lot of Canadians. It's not a new concept within the legal community. It has been done before, and if I'm saying this correctly, the Gladue report, if that's correct?
That's right.
How has the introduction of that report that took a look at Indigenous communities played out? What does it look like?
Well, it looks very similar to what I've described for cultural assessment reports. I would say this: Aboriginal people in Canada and Indigenous people, they have a unique history in Canada, and they have special constitutional status, as they should. But the function of a cultural assessment report is somewhat similar in that the idea is to try and assist the court to understand the offender and not simply the circumstances of the offense, and to understand the systemic context to why the person is before the court. So there are similarities. I think the Gladue reports have had a great success, and certainly based on our review of what's happened in Nova Scotia, we know that the courts have taken cultural sensitivity reports very seriously.
It's an interesting concept, and we're looking forward to following this story. Wayne Vanderbeek, thanks for joining us from Ottawa today.